Why avoidants can't stay away from the super empath, no matter what. Have you ever noticed how the person who pulls away the hardest somehow keeps finding their way back to you? It's not magic. It's not fate. It's psychology. And if you're a super empath, you might be the very gravity an avoidant can't escape. There's a moment in every connection where patterns reveal the truth. Not the words, not the promises, but the patterns. And if you've ever been in a dance with someone avoidant, you know their pattern well. They pull away just when things start to feel real. They retreat, they shut down, they suddenly become busy, cold, or distant, and yet they don't disappear. They circle back again and again. Why? Because the super empath, you, activates something in them they don't find anywhere else. A super empath doesn't just care. You attune. You feel the emotional shifts before they even speak. You soothe without smothering. You show interest without possession. You create safety without demanding it back. Avoidants don't stay because they know what to do with that kind of love. They stay because they don't. The super empath represents what they've never learned to handle. Gentleness that doesn't manipulate. Connection without pressure. Intimacy without threat. You become the one place where their emotional nervous system feels both challenged and comforted. Strength and softness in the same package. That combination is rare, and it's magnetic. But here's the truth you need to hear. Just because an avoidant can't stay away from you, doesn't mean they can stay with you. Your power is not in being the person they always return to. Your power is in recognizing why they return and deciding whether their consistency, their growth, and their effort match the depth of what you bring. Being a super empath is not a curse. It's a gift, but a gift must be protected. You can't save someone from patterns they refuse to outgrow. You can't be the safe haven and their escape route. So if an avoidant keeps coming back, understand this. It's not because you're weak or needy. It's because you're rare. And sometimes the most powerful move a super empath can make is to stop being the emotional home of someone who refuses to live there. Avoidants return to the super empath because without even trying, the super empath creates a type of emotional safety that feels rare, almost impossible to find. For someone who operates from an avoidant attachment style, intimacy feels like walking too close to a fire. Get too near and it burns. Stay too far and they feel cold. Their entire relational pattern is built on this internal conflict, wanting connection but fearing the vulnerability that comes with it. Most people either crowd them with expectations or pull so far away that the avoidant's deeper longing never gets touched. But the super empath interacts differently. They offer presence without pressure, openness without intrusion, connection without suffocating intensity. To an avoidant, this is a foreign experience that registers as both soothing and disarming. What the avoidant doesn't consciously register is that the super empath is reading emotional signals long before words ever enter the conversation. They sense tension in the avoidant's tone before it turns into withdrawal. They notice discomfort in the avoidant's silence before it becomes distance. They adjust without being asked, softening the edges of intimacy so it feels less like a demand and more like an invitation. This is a powerful skill, and it can feel like a kind of emotional magic for someone who has always felt misunderstood. Instead of feeling chased, the avoidant feels seen. Instead of feeling trapped, they feel respected. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, they feel strangely calm. And calm is something avoidants don't often associate with closeness. What the super empath does instinctively is create emotional spaciousness. They don't pressure the avoidant to define the relationship at every step. They don't panic when the avoidant retreats into their own world. They don't take the distance as rejection, but as communication. They understand that some people connect differently, and they meet the avoidant where they are without sacrificing their own warmth. This is precisely why the avoidant keeps coming back. To them, this combination of emotional safety and non-demanding connection feels like oxygen. It gives them room to breathe while still reminding them that someone cares. The avoidant is accustomed to experiences where closeness feels tied to obligation. They worry that giving a little affection will require them to give everything. They fear that letting someone close will mean losing autonomy. They expect intense emotional reactions or clinginess from partners who want more connection than they can handle. But with the super empath, the emotional structure is different. The empath doesn't seek ownership. They seek understanding. They don't push the avoidant to open up before they're ready. They don't interpret emotional space as abandonment. This lack of pressure confuses the avoidant at first. They may even test it. They pull away harder, expecting the familiar reaction: panic, anger, pleading, or guilt. But when none of that comes, when the super empath remains grounded and steady, something shifts inside the avoidant. Instead of being repelled by the distance, they realize they miss the warmth they left behind. It's not that the super empath tolerates poor behavior. It's that they understand emotional patterns and respond in ways that soothe rather than escalate. The avoidant begins to associate this person with emotional safety, something they've rarely known. Deep inside, avoidants crave connection just as much as anyone else, but it has to come in a form that doesn't threaten their independence or sense of control. The super empath doesn't threaten either. Their energy says, "I'm here, but I'm not here to cage you." That message is irresistible to someone who has always associated closeness with entrapment. The avoidant also finds themselves returning for reasons they struggle to articulate. They feel more regulated around the super empath. Conversations feel easier. They don't have to perform. They don't have to defend themselves. For the first time, vulnerability feels manageable instead of catastrophic. A super empath's presence acts like a stabilizer for the avoidant's nervous system. They experience connection without panic and distance without punishment. This balance is profoundly healing, even though the avoidant may not recognize it that way. The avoidant returns because the super empath becomes the emotional home they never thought they could have. Not a home that traps them inside, but a home with open windows and a door that doesn't lock. They return because they can breathe there. They return because the connection doesn't demand that they abandon themselves. They return because they are met with compassion instead of criticism. They return because something inside them relaxes in the presence of someone who doesn't force intimacy, but still invites it. In a world where people often take avoidant behavior personally, the super empath sees the deeper fear beneath the withdrawal. They respond not with desperation, but with emotional intelligence. And for an avoidant, that combination is rare enough that once they experience it, it becomes nearly impossible to forget, no matter how many times they try to walk away. The reason avoidants feel so drawn back to the super empath is that the empath possesses a unique and almost instinctive way of understanding emotions, often before those emotions are even expressed. To someone who struggles to articulate their inner world, this level of attunement feels nothing short of extraordinary. Avoidants often spend their lives feeling like their emotions are too complicated, too inconvenient, or too unsafe to share. They learned early on that expressing their needs might lead to disappointment, pressure, or rejection. So they built emotional walls and internal rules: stay independent, don't rely on anyone, don't reveal too much. Most people who approach them collide with these walls and bounce off, but the super empath doesn't collide. They observe, they feel, they understand. What makes the super empath so magnetic is that they don't just listen to the avoidant's words. They listen to the quiet places between those words. They pick up on the shift in tone when the avoidant is overwhelmed. They notice the slight withdrawal in body language when the avoidant feels exposed or uncomfortable. They sense when the avoidant needs space not as rejection, but as emotional self-regulation. The empath's intuition allows them to read emotional patterns like a language. And for the avoidant, who often feels misunderstood even in relationships where nothing is wrong, being read so accurately feels both soothing and startling. There's a moment avoidants rarely talk about, when they realize someone actually gets them without them having to explain everything. This moment is deeply disarming. For most of their lives, they've been conditioned to believe that their emotions are theirs to handle alone. When a person comes along and understands those emotions instinctively, it disrupts the avoidant's internal programming. They're not used to being anticipated. They're not used to someone recognizing their needs before those needs turn into withdrawal or shutdown. The super empath makes them feel seen, not in a way that exposes them, but in a way that comforts them. what the avoidant begins to experience is a form of emotional resonance. They feel safe enough to soften, not because they are pushed to, but because the empath's presence makes the emotional environment feel less threatening. Avoidants often fear that they will be misunderstood or judged if they express themselves fully. But the super empath's energy carries a message that says, I understand you. You don't have to justify your feelings here. This kind of understanding gives the avoidant permission to be more authentic, even if that authenticity comes in small increments. It's not dramatic openness, it's subtle, a longer conversation than usual, a deeper admission than they typically allow, a moment of vulnerability they didn't plan to offer. The empath's strength lies in their emotional sensitivity. Not in being overwhelmed by others' feelings, but in being able to interpret them with clarity and kindness. They offer understanding without conditions. They don't ask the avoidant to be different. They don't shame them for withdrawing. They don't punish them for being guarded. Instead, they create a relational atmosphere where the avoidant's internal world feels accepted rather than scrutinized. This acceptance is powerful. Avoidants rarely feel emotionally safe enough to let down their defenses, but the super empath's intuitive presence gradually allows those defenses to relax. Another reason the avoidant keeps gravitating back is that the empath doesn't meet emotional distance with emotional distance. Many people respond to avoidance with hurt, anger, or detachment, understandably so, but the super empath doesn't mirror the avoidance shutdown. Instead, they maintain emotional steadiness. They stay connected without chasing, compassionate without demanding. This steadiness communicates something profound. Your emotional rhythm doesn't scare me. For someone who has always believed that attachment threatens their independence, this is incredibly grounding. It allows them to remain interconnected without feeling engulfed. The avoidant also feels drawn because the super empath doesn't misinterpret their emotional cues. When the avoidant withdraws, the empath doesn't assume it means disinterest. They understand it as overwhelm. When the avoidant hesitates to open up, the empath doesn't interpret it as deceit or manipulation. They see it as fear. When the avoidant tries to regain emotional control through silence, the empath doesn't catastrophize. They give space, and that space becomes an invitation rather than a punishment. This emotional intelligence allows the avoidant to experience connection without facing the misunderstandings they've grown accustomed to. Over time, the avoidant begins to associate the super empath with emotional clarity. They feel understood even when they are not speaking. They feel supported even when they are being distant. They feel valued without the burden of performance. This level of emotional attunement is addictive because it touches the avoidant's deepest wound, the belief that no one will ever truly know them. The empath's understanding challenges this belief and replaces it with something the avoidant didn't expect: comfort. And comfort is something avoidants rarely admit they need, but always feel drawn toward. The super empath becomes the person the avoidant can return to when they feel overwhelmed, misunderstood, or disconnected from themselves. Not because the empath fixes them, but because the empath understands them without needing explanations. There is no emotional chaos to manage, no pressure to be someone they're not. Instead, there is a quiet, stable connection that nurtures the avoidant's desire for closeness in a way that doesn't violate their need for independence. This combination of deep understanding and gentle connection becomes the emotional anchor that pulls the avoidant back, even when their instinct tells them to run. In the end, the avoidant feels something with the super empath that they rarely feel anywhere else: understood without effort, seen without fear, and accepted without condition. And that is the exact reason they can't stay away. Avoidants often find themselves drawn back to the super empath because the relationship challenges their emotional patterns in ways they don't anticipate. It isn't that they suddenly know how to handle deep intimacy or feel ready to dive into emotional vulnerability. Quite the opposite. They return because the super empath activates an inner conflict that both unsettles and awakens them. They encounter a type of connection they are not practiced in navigating, one that is gentle but strong, warm but grounded, caring but not consuming. This duality creates a unique emotional tension inside the avoidant, and it's this exact tension that keeps pulling them back. Avoidant individuals are used to environments where they can predict relational dynamics. They know what to expect when they pull away. Maybe anger, maybe pleading, maybe someone else pulling away as well. That familiar pattern reinforces their belief that closeness is risky, that emotions are messy, that people are demanding. But the super empath disrupts this pattern. When the avoidant withdraws, the empath remains calm rather than panicked. When the avoidant becomes distant, the empath doesn't crumble or chase. When the avoidant hesitates, the empath doesn't pressure them into decisions they're not ready for. This is confusing to someone who has built an identity around believing that too much closeness will cost them their freedom. The empath's reactions don't fit the script, and because the avoidant can't slot them into the predictable categories they're used to, it forces them to reconsider their internal narrative about connection. The avoidant doesn't return because they feel fully safe. They return because they feel challenged in a way that feels meaningful. The super empath is the first person who doesn't reinforce the avoidant's fears. Where others might confirm the avoidant's belief that intimacy equals chaos, the empath introduces a new possibility. Intimacy can be calm, balanced, respectful, and growth-oriented. The empath's emotional steadiness quietly pushes the avoidant to examine their own patterns, not by demanding change, but by embodying a version of connection the avoidant has never experienced. This challenge is subtle but powerful. Avoidants aren't used to being around someone who can hold emotional space without collapsing under the weight of it. They are not familiar with someone who can let them step back without turning it into a crisis. They are not accustomed to a person who doesn't interpret their hesitation as rejection. The super empath's responses present a mirror the avoidant has never looked into. A mirror that reflects their defenses, their fears, and their longing all at once. It makes them think. It makes them question. It makes them feel. And these shifts are unsettling because they disrupt the avoidant's emotional equilibrium. Yet they are also intriguing because the avoidant senses that something about this connection has the potential to heal or expand their emotional world. In many ways, the empath becomes an emotional catalyst for the avoidant, not by force, but by example. The empath's openness highlights the avoidant's guardedness. The empath's comfort with feelings contrasts the avoidant's discomfort. The empath's willingness to connect reveals the avoidant's fear of closeness. And although this might sound like it would push the avoidant away, it often has the opposite effect. The avoidant returns not because they suddenly know how to manage intimacy, but because something in them recognizes that the connection is different, and different is compelling. The avoidant senses growth, even if they can't articulate it. What pulls the avoidant back is the realization that despite their fears, the connection with the empath didn't lead to the negative outcomes they expected. They didn't lose themselves. They weren't judged. They weren't smothered. Their boundaries were respected. Their silence wasn't filled with accusations. Their distance wasn't punished. This creates internal confusion. If closeness with this person doesn't hurt me, then what am I running from? That question alone is enough to draw them back. The avoidant returns because the super empath offers an emotional landscape that challenges the avoidant's belief systems without threatening their core need for autonomy. At the same time, the avoidant is propelled by curiosity. The super empath's emotional strength is unlike what they've seen. The empath doesn't just feel deeply, they feel deeply with stability. This combination intrigues the avoidant because it suggests that emotional connection might not be as dangerous as they've always believed. It might even be something they could learn to tolerate or, in rare moments, desire. The avoidant is not returning because they're ready for that leap, but because they can sense the possibility of a different kind of intimacy, one that doesn't drown them but might actually expand them. Ultimately, the avoidant keeps coming back to the super empath because the empath represents both safety and challenge. The avoidant feels comforted by the empath's emotional intelligence, but confronted by their own patterns in the process. They don't stay because they know how to handle the connection. They stay because it disrupts their defenses in a way that feels strangely right. They feel pushed, not through pressure, but through possibility. And that possibility is something they can't quite walk away from, no matter how many times they try. A super empath's power in the dynamic with an avoidant doesn't come from being the one who is always patient, always forgiving, or always emotionally available. Their true power lies in their capacity to recognize their own worth and to ask a fundamental question: is this person capable of meeting me where I am? Many super empaths are deeply compassionate and naturally willing to understand the emotional struggles of others, including avoidance. They see the avoidance fears not as rejection, but as woundedness. They interpret emotional distance as protection, not indifference. And this level of insight often makes the avoidant feel safe enough to remain connected, even if inconsistently. But the real turning point happens when the super empath realizes that it is not enough to be someone the avoidant always returns to. What matters is whether the avoidant starts returning with intention, accountability, and effort. Being someone's emotional home is meaningful, but not if the person treats it like a place they visit, only when they are lonely or overwhelmed. The super empath's gift is their ability to hold space without losing themselves in it. But this gift becomes a burden when the avoidant uses the empath's steadiness as a cushion rather than a reason to grow. Many avoidants come back because they feel soothed, safe, and less judged around the super empath. But none of that matters if they remain incapable of offering consistency or vulnerability in return. The empath's real strength emerges when they stop interpreting the avoidant's return as proof of love and instead begin evaluating the quality of that return. The avoidance pattern, leaving, then coming back, is emotionally intoxicating for someone who tends to love deeply. It creates an illusion of progress, a sense that the avoidant is slowly overcoming their fears when in reality, they may simply be cycling through their comfort and discomfort. The super empath's power is recognizing that patterns speak louder than intentions and louder than apologies. It is recognizing that someone's return is not evidence of growth. It is simply evidence of attachment. What the empath ultimately learns is that attachment without effort is not enough. When the super empath begins to ask for consistency, the dynamic shifts. The avoidant can no longer rely on the empath's endless emotional generosity. They can no longer expect the empath to absorb the imbalance of closeness and distance. Asking for consistency is not about demanding emotional labor. It's about insisting on reciprocity. It's the empath saying, if you want access to me, you must show up for me. This expectation is powerful because it forces the avoidant to confront their own behaviors instead of hiding behind them. It asks them to choose, evolve, or step aside. Many avoidants are not used to this kind of boundary. They are accustomed to people either chasing after them or giving up on them. The super empath does neither. They don't chase because they value themselves too much, and they don't abruptly cut ties unless necessary because they understand emotional complexity. Instead, they hold a steady, strong middle ground. I care for you, but I care for me too. This stance is what ultimately reveals the avoidant's true capacity for change. Some will rise to the challenge, slowly and imperfectly learning to communicate, to return with purpose instead of panic, to stay instead of retreat. Others won't. And the empath's strength is in seeing the difference. The super empath's power lies in refusing to be the emotional safety net for someone who will not build their own emotional foundation. It lies in no longer romanticizing potential and instead valuing patterns. It lies in choosing to invest in relationships where their emotional intelligence is appreciated rather than exploited. When the empath stops accepting breadcrumbs and starts expecting consistency, they shift the entire relational dynamic. The avoidant must confront the discomfort they have been avoiding, or they risk losing the one person who truly understands them. This is where the empath's real influence emerges. Their boundaries act as a catalyst for clarity. An avoidant may return repeatedly when nothing is required of them, but when the empath sets standards, real, grounded standards, the avoidant is faced with a new reality. They must decide whether to stretch into growth or retreat into old patterns. And whichever path they choose, the empath begins to understand that their value does not come from being needed, but from being respected. Some avoidants will choose growth because they see that the connection with the empath is worth the discomfort of evolution. They begin to communicate more clearly, to take accountability, to stay present even when their instincts urge them to withdraw. They won't do it perfectly, but they will show effort. And effort is the currency of change. Others will choose their comfort zone, They will continue the cycle of distance and return, never fully committing, always hovering in emotional limbo. And the super empath's power lies in recognizing that this isn't love. It's attachment mixed with fear and refusing to be stuck in that loop. Ultimately, the empath's strength comes from understanding that they deserve a relationship where their emotional depth is met with emotional availability. They deserve someone who doesn't just return but stays, someone who doesn't just seek comfort but offers it, someone who doesn't just need their softness but rises to meet their strength. The avoidant may not be able to stay, but the empath can. They can stay with themselves, with their boundaries, with their worth. And that is the moment their power fully awakens. Not when the avoidant comes back, but when the empath realizes they no longer need them to. Just because an avoidant can't stay away from a super empath doesn't mean they can stay in a way that's healthy or sustainable. This is one of the most difficult truths for a super empath to accept. Being irresistible to someone's emotional wounds is not the same as being compatible with their emotional capacity. Avoidants often come back because the connection feels safe, soothing, and non-threatening. They return out of longing, comfort, and the quiet hope that maybe this time they will feel brave enough to stay. But wanting closeness and having the emotional tools to maintain it are two entirely different things. Avoidants are often caught in an internal push-pull dynamic. They crave connection deeply, even desperately at times, but the moment intimacy feels too real, too intense, or too vulnerable, their instincts push them away to reestablish emotional safety. This push-pull is not a choice, it's a coping mechanism shaped by past experiences and unhealed fears. The presence of a super empath can temporarily soothe this internal conflict, which is why they return again and again. But soothing the conflict is not the same as resolving it. Without growth, awareness, or effort, the avoidance pattern remains unchanged, and when the pattern doesn't change, the empath becomes stuck in the same emotional loop. Passion, withdrawal, return, repeat. The empath must understand that being the emotional safe place someone retreats to is not enough to sustain a relationship. A bond cannot thrive on moments of connection followed by long stretches of distance. The empath's ability to understand the avoidance fears may feel noble, compassionate, even spiritual at times, but understanding cannot replace reciprocity. You can empathize with someone's triggers, but you cannot build a partnership on them. You can see someone's potential, but you cannot live in it. You can love someone's wounds, but you cannot heal them for them. Avoidants often come back because the super empath offers a type of emotional nourishment they rarely experience. The empath listens deeply, responds gently, and holds emotional space without judgment. The avoidant feels calm, understood, and validated, things they may not have encountered elsewhere, but the avoidant's return is often driven by relief, not readiness. They come back because the empath feels like home, but they leave because home feels overwhelming when they don't know how to inhabit it. Their heart pulls them forward and their fear pulls them back. Without inner work, fear always wins. For the super empath, this cycle becomes emotionally exhausting. They begin to question their worth, wondering why someone who feels so drawn to them can't choose them in a consistent way. The truth is, it has nothing to do with the empath's value. The avoidant isn't staying because they haven't yet learned how to stay with anyone, not just with the empath. Emotional intimacy requires capacity, not just attraction. It requires security, not just chemistry. It requires self-awareness, not just desire. The avoidant may feel everything deeply, but feeling deeply is not the same as showing up fully. The empath's greatest challenge is recognizing the difference between connection and commitment. Connection is what pulls two people toward each other. Commitment is what keeps them there. Avoidants often excel at connection in short bursts. They can be warm, attentive, and present in moments when they feel safe. But commitment requires enduring discomfort, working through fears, communicating honestly, and staying emotionally engaged, even when vulnerability feels threatening. Without these skills, the avoidant will always struggle to remain consistent, no matter how strong the bond feels. This is why the empath must protect their emotional gift. They must recognize that their ability to create safety does not obligate them to remain in a relationship where they receive so little in return. They must remember that compassion has boundaries. They must understand that their job is not to inspire the avoidant to heal, but to ensure they are not sacrificing themselves while waiting for that healing. The empath's power lies not in endlessly accommodating someone else's fear, but in choosing relationships where their emotional depth is matched with emotional availability. The avoidant may never truly stay until they confront their own patterns, do their own healing, and learn to tolerate the vulnerability that intimacy requires. The empath can be a catalyst, but they cannot be the cure. And sometimes the most loving thing the empath can do for themselves and for the avoidant is to step out of the cycle entirely. Because no matter how much an avoidant returns, the empath deserves someone who doesn't just circle back, but shows up and stays. In the end, the dynamic between the super empath and the avoidant isn't a mystery, it's a mirror. It reflects the avoidant's deepest fears and the empath's deepest strengths. It reveals how two people can feel magnetically drawn to each other for completely opposite reasons. One because they finally feel emotionally understood, and the other because they finally feel emotionally needed. But a powerful connection means nothing if it cannot evolve. A bond with no consistency becomes an emotional treadmill. You run, you sweat, you hope, but you never move forward. The truth is this: the avoidant may return again and again, but it is the super empath who must decide what that return truly means. Not every connection that feels intense is meant to be kept. Not every person who comes back is meant to stay. Sometimes the greatest strength is not in holding on, but in knowing your worth well enough to require more than emotional fragments. The empath's gift is rare, profound, and deeply transformative, but only when shared with someone willing to rise to meet it. So if you are the super empath in this story, remember this: your heart is not a halfway house for people who fear their own emotions. Your compassion is not a shelter for someone unwilling to grow. And your love is not a revolving door. You deserve a connection where you are not just the soft place someone returns to. You deserve someone who stays, builds, shows up, and chooses you with the same depth you offer them. Let this be the moment you recognize your value, claim your boundaries, and protect your emotional gift. Because when a super empath finally realizes their power, everything changes. Thank you for being here, for listening with an open mind and an open heart. Thank you for caring enough about your growth to dive into truths that aren't always easy to hear. Thank you for valuing your emotional journey and for giving yourself permission to understand it more deeply. Take what serves you, release what doesn't, and remember, your story isn't defined by who comes back, but by who deserves to stay. Thank you, truly. Take care of your heart. And until next time, be gentle with yourself,